right, so we know that in 1964 and 1965, we have two big civil rights victories. Name them for me one more time. 1964, we pass the Civil Rights Act, and what does that do? Bans segregation in public accommodations. Very good. Then in 1965, we see the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which we just discussed, is going to end things like grandfather clauses, literacy tests, allow the federal government to get involved. Now, who's the president for both of those laws? LBJ, right? Lyndon Johnson is president from 1963 until 1968. So Lyndon Johnson is the president. He's going to push that through along with it. What do we call his big umbrella of programs? The Great Society. He's going to encourage that advocacy. And although lots of people, you know, white politicians in Washington, D.C. are feeling very proud of themselves, pat on the back, look at us. We passed two major civil rights bills, like landmark legislation. Sounds awesome, aren't we cool? They are completely flummoxed by the idea that despite these apparent successes in the civil rights movement, that we see an actual increase in racial tension and violence throughout the North. In places like LA, which isn't really the North, that's the West, those are the very famous Watts riots. They lasted a really long time and were very destructive of property as well as human life. There were also riots in Detroit, in Chicago, in New York. Just really, in all of these major cities, we're seeing race riots. People are dying, right? 141 dead over the course of 2 years. More than almost 5,000 people are injured. Thousands of dollars worth of property destroyed. Why are we having these riots? If you were going to write one down, I would write the Watts riot. That's a specific one you could list. The Watts riot in LA. So we're having all of these riots despite the fact that we are seeing civil rights legislation come through. And so the government is so puzzled that they create something called the Kerner Commission. You guys remember the 9/11 Commission? You don't remember, you were babies, but you've heard of the 9/11 Commission? So like, we were puzzled, how could we possibly be taken by surprise on September 11th? Like, we need to know what happened. So they created Congress created a commission where a group of people, investigators, and they brought in people to testify, tried to figure out what is the answer to the question. Well, the Kerner Commission was put together by Congress to try to figure out what the heck is going on. You know, what has happened? Why are we having all of these riots if we've had these apparent successes? And the Kerner Commission does a lot of research, and they report back a few months later, and their conclusion is that white racism is to blame for the continual, like, racial conflict in the North. That basically, despite the legislation, which helped in the South a bit, right? In the South, there were structural barriers that stopped Black Americans from having rights, and so these new laws got rid of those structural barriers. That was a step forward. But in the North, those structural barriers were mostly already gone, even before those laws. And so the frustration was that although the structural barriers are gone, what's not gone? Racism, the ideology, right? What's not gone is that when a Black person applies for a job, even if technically they're allowed to have it, they're almost never hired because of racism. Or when a white person goes to a realtor, when a Black person goes to a realtor and wants to look at a house in a particular neighborhood, even though technically that we've gotten rid of redlining, that realtor won't show them a house in a neighborhood of their choice. Even though they're technically allowed to vote and they can go and vote, the white legislatures in northern states gerrymander districts to make sure that even though they can vote, they don't have any actual say in the political process in the end. That it was these sort of hidden factors that weren't addressed by the legislation that was what caused this continual tension, the sense that even if the structures were put in or were sort of gotten away with, that racism would keep them from success anyway. So the Kerner Commission, this is a really big deal. There's lots of hope throughout the civil rights movement after the Kerner Commission's report. Like, woohoo, we're gonna see real change. Somebody actually gets it, that there's real, that racism is a thing and it's a problem. But the recommendations that Congress comes up with after hearing that report are, well, let's just send some more money to inner cities. Let's just make some more grants to help build up new schools. Let's have, a better soup kitchen program. Let's do some more after-school programs. Let's just throw some more money at the problem. Even though the Kerner Commission said the problem was white racism, not Black poverty, right? That was one of the things they investigated. Is it poverty that causes this crisis? Is it like lack of morals? They had all kinds of interesting questions they were looking at. Interesting being sort of an interesting word. But rather than address the thing that the Kerner Commission said was the problem, racism, let's have public relations campaigns or encourage cooperation between communities or whatever. No, they didn't address that at all. Congress says the answer is to throw money. The answer is let's just give some more money to inner cities. That was a real frustrating moment. And this, along with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In 1968, he's killed by a guy named James Earl Ray while he's standing on the balcony of his hotel room. these sort of two events, the Kerner Commission's report and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., really causes a palpable change in the tenor of the African American civil rights movement. It's not like there hadn't been radicals before this. Malcolm X is a popular one. People always talk about Malcolm X. Malcolm X provides a fairly interesting foil for Martin Luther King Jr., right? They both want civil rights, and we can kind of contrast them in the same way that we contrasted what 19th century reformers? Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, right? They have sort of similar like contrasts of ideology about the immediacy, about the methods, about the language. So Malcolm X is assassinated actually the year before MLK. So there was certainly radicalism. There were those who argued that we should be more aggressive in fighting for rights even before MLK is assassinated. But MLK was the single strongest voice in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And MLK's insistence that no matter how desperate or how trying or how important the needs, that the focus on maintaining the moral high ground and what he called soul power, the importance of nonviolence and civil disobedience, the importance of those virtues was the most important thing. That was the thing that they had to focus on, and was very successful, right? Would those Woolworth counter, sit-ins have been as successful if the video had captured, the black guy turning around and punching the white guy in the face after the white guy threw salt on him? No, that would not have been as successful. They would have looked like troublemakers. So MLK really felt so strong about that he was able to kind of define the movement. But after his death, other more radical elements that already existed before are going to now rise to their own prominence. So we see people, so Malcolm X again is dead before this happens, but his vein of black nationalism is going to come to prominence. SNCC, which stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you say that's SNCC. So the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they've done a whole lot. They worked to help organize freedom rides. They'd been involved in the lunch counter sit-ins. SNCC had been a big part of the movement during its sort of peaceful or passive, nonviolent, whatever element. But SNCC gets a new leader. This guy, his name is Stokely Carmichael. And Stokely Carmichael kicks all the whites out of SNCC. Says, this is an organization for black people. We don't want white people in this organization. He's the one who pushes black women sort of out of the spotlight. He wants black men to have this like leadership position. And again, it's much more radical. He's pushing, using angry language, calling out whites in general as being the problem, even if they were supportive of civil rights. Then everyone kind of knows about the Black Panthers. Here's a picture of them. The Black Panthers are interesting because, as we talked, a few of us in the warm-up, they weren't really violent. In fact, one of the things that the Black Panthers within the black community are the best known for is their after-school program and their children's breakfast programs. So this is a community improvement organization. They are working within the black community. They create an after-school program for black kids while their parents are working when they come home from school. They provide breakfast every morning to every kid in the neighborhood to send them off to school with a full tummy. They do lots of really, really great community building kind of things. They believe in black nationalism, in building up their own community. They want leadership in their own community. But they also argue that the idea of nonviolent resistance was done. That if somebody comes and punches them in the face, they're going to punch back. If they have white racists are going to come and hunt down black people and shoot them with no justice, then black people should arm themselves and shoot back if necessary. It was kind of their philosophy. California had rules against concealed carry, and so they got around it by openly carrying their weapons, which is a little bit intimidating looking. Obviously, the police don't like this. When police would drive through black neighborhoods, the Black Panthers would have a car that would follow the police officer around, like in the neighborhood. Obviously, we didn't like that. The FBI didn't like that. Many Black Panther leaders are going to be assassinated by the FBI through a whole bunch of what used to be covert operations and has since been sort of like uncovered. But here's the point. Are they wrong necessarily? Is it wrong to say that if somebody gets punched, they should be able to defend themselves? Is it wrong to say that like white racism is the problem when even the U.S. Congress says that white racism is the problem? Is it wrong? Are any of those things wrong necessarily? But what? Why do we not see any more significant civil rights victories after 1965? Because how many middle-class white people in the North are jumping on board this movement? Not very many, right? This is not the feel-good movement, oh yeah, let's definitely help these people. Oh yeah, I want to get involved. Oh yeah, I want to help that cause. I want to make sure that happens. So again, it's like Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois. Was Du Bois wrong to demand immediate social, political, and economic equality? Of course not. But it didn't work. and in fact brought danger to people who advocated for Du Bois's ideas. They were in danger in the South. They were actively opposed. So it's this sort of this great injustice continues even in the process of trying to find justice. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk now about the Asian American movement, which is a really big umbrella for a whole bunch of different smaller movements. But broadly speaking here, lots of times the Asian American civil rights movement gets kind of overlooked because of something that you might have heard before, this idea that Asians are a so-called model minority. Have you ever heard that? What does that mean for Asian Americans to be the model minority? What does that mean? Well, but why not? What would the argument be? So whereas African Americans, for example, are as a whole less wealthy, less educated, and less like economically successful than white Americans, Asian Americans as a whole are more wealthy and more successful and more educated than like white Americans as a whole. And this has been true even in the 1960s. Compared to other minority groups, Asian Americans as a whole tended to do better. There are lots of reasons for this. We're going to talk about them briefly because I think it's interesting, and I think you should know, but bless you, because I think we still deal with the idea of Asian Americans as a model minority today that I think it's important to think about. So a couple of things. First of all, let's go all the way back to the 1870s and 80s when we began to see the first movement. At that point, it was primarily from China and from Japan, right? Immigrants from Asia to the U.S. were primarily Chinese and Japanese. And where did they live? West Coast, okay. Think about all other minorities that weren't liked either. In cities they tended to live in, it's 2 words, starts with an E. Ethnic enclaves, right? So because of discrimination, they're pushed into ethnic enclaves. And we know that ethnic enclaves are problematic because the city police don't provide services there, and they're isolated, and they have less investment. We know that there's all kinds of problems associated with that. But just like the ethnic enclave in Harlem also had sort of a benefit in the end of boosting this cultural renaissance among the black community, ethnic enclaves for Asian Americans turned into something that was turned in by Asian immigrants to something that was useful. So because they were so isolated, the community bond, and it's not just true of Asian Americans, but also just general and ethnic enclaves, community bonds were very strong. So the second factor is that most Asian immigrants who came to the United States tended to have a little more money than most other immigrants did, right? This changes in the 1960s and 70s when we begin to see refugees from Vietnam. But up through about 1950, immigrants coming from Asia to the United States tended to be a little bit better off. They brought with them a little bit of money, as opposed to immigrants coming from, like Romania, brought essentially nothing with them, right? So that little bit of capital was going to be useful, because if we have a little bit of money, then here's what happens. Many, especially in the Chinese community, but also in the Japanese community, and then became a really big deal in the Korean community in the 1950s and 60s, groups of immigrants would form cooperatives. So there'd be a group of 5 or 6 families, and they would all have a little bit of money, not enough to do anything on their own. But with that little bit of money, they'd pool it together, and they would loan it all to one person. And that one person would get involved in some kind of business. And because of some of the social conditions, remember, early Asian immigrants came during the gold rush, right? There was an intense need for services because so many people were coming to the West and didn't bring the means to cook or didn't have a home, whatever it was. So these Asian American families who had pooled all their money, this one family now would open a laundry, right? In the 1880s, the Chinese laundry was this huge stereotypical thing, kind of like Vietnamese nail salon these days, right? This is this sort of stereotypical place. And so they'd open a laundry. All those families would work together. They would so this person who got the loan, they would hire the other families. They'd help them to, they'd give them a little bit of income as well. They would do all of this work. Then when that business was successful enough, they would pay the loan back, but not divvy it up again. They'd pay the loan back to the next family in line. And the next family would get this whole sum of money, and they would start their own business. Maybe it was a restaurant. Maybe they did a cleaning service. Whatever it was, they're taking these bottom-of-the-ladder kind of jobs, right? Jobs nobody else wants, jobs that are difficult and undesirable, but they're taking them, they build them into businesses. And so this is going to sort of set that foundation of economic capital. Then later on, when poorer immigrants begin to come, in the 1920s and 30s, for example, these existing communities have businesses. So even if you don't have the means yourself to own your own business, well, now there's someone from your home country who has your similar ancestry who will hire you, or who'll be willing to help you get involved. So this sort of like community element is going to be a big deal. Then when we get into the 1950s and 60s, we see that even when these days Asian immigrants are not particularly wealthy compared to immigrants as a whole, Asian immigrants tend to, as a whole, be much more educated when they arrive than other immigrants coming. And you're going, well, what does that mean? Well, a couple of things. First of all, even though many Asian immigrants who arrive, and again, we're lumping a whole bunch of different countries together here, but even when Asian immigrants who arrive aren't able to get a job in their field, for example, I have a friend who goes to my church group, and she's from Laos, and her husband was a doctor in Laos before they came here, but is not allowed to practice medicine in the United States because he doesn't have a U.S. medical license and doesn't have the money to go back to school, like to go to medical school in the U.S. to do it all over again. So even though he has a pretty modest job, he's not working as a doctor, even though he was capable of being a doctor, or is capable of being a doctor in his home country. That education is worth more than the job you get, right? It's also worth social capital, because if I'm educated, if I've been through a degree program, I know how the system works. I'm able to figure out the bureaucracy. I can figure out how to get benefits. I can learn to read more quickly or learn English more quickly because I have this experience. Maybe I already knew English in my original studies. There's just all these benefits that come with being educated, even if the job doesn't translate. So this higher level of income, of education that Asian immigrants tend to have means that their children tend to excel more quickly, right? Because if you have a good education, even if you're not able to use that degree because of whatever structural factors, because you're an immigrant, you're going to help your kids to do well in school because you did well in school. And that's going to, again, mean that like second generation Asian immigrant children tend to do better in school than second generation immigrant children of other like areas of the world. So all these sort of things contribute to the idea of Asians as a model minority. But does that mean that they don't need help? Can we name some examples of structural racism against Asian Americans in this country? Japanese internment, Executive Order 1966. What else? Right, so abuse against Chinese immigrants in the 1860s and 70s. Immigration orders like the 1882 law that excluded Chinese immigration, right? The Gentleman's Agreement, 1902. We're going to get the Japanese out of here if you'll just like allow them to go to school. There have been plenty of examples of this systemic racism against Asian American immigrants. So what are some things that the Asian American movement is going to go for? Well, the Asian American movement is going to happen almost exclusively within the university environment. So on college campuses, we're going to see like Asian American groups trying to build awareness and a sense of cultural pride. The Hydra is one example. It's predominantly a Japanese publication, but what sort of billed itself as being for Asians in America across the board. And they would publish art by Asian immigrants. They would talk about issues related to Asians in America. They began advocacy for things like an Asian studies program in universities, right? We should be able to study this culture. We should see the culture for the value that it has. They advocated for things like reducing stereotypes like in movies. They advocated for an end to the Vietnam War, which was seen as a big problem, and nationalism in general. Okay, we're good there.